Our next speaker, Lloyd Smith, will be presenting for perhaps more than, I'm not sure which round of the Competent Communicator Manual we've been through. It's got to at least have been one, I'm guessing 3 times through, 6 times round through the Competent Communicator Manual, which is comprised of 10 speeches. I'm looking forward to some inspiration. His introduction reads, "It's probably human nature to think the good old days were better than today." This evening, Lloyd Smith will complete his 6th Competent Communicator with Project 10, had I been meeting. Inspire your audience by looking at a time that seems long ago, but really it isn't.
My dad was born in a very large family. He had 8 brothers and sisters. The entire mob ended up living in the Spokane area. As the generations went on, the family got bigger and bigger and bigger. And once every summer, somebody decided, wow, what a great idea it would be to get the entire group together in one of the parks in Spokane Valley and have sort of a family reunion type thing. And so they did. Aunts and uncles and miscellaneous cousins and nephews and various hangers-oners and people I'd never seen before in my life, and frankly I never want to see again in my life. They all were at this park. Well, after my dad turned about 90, he was the oldest member of the family, and the various nephews and nieces and hangers and honors and whatnot would bring in pictures, old black and white pictures they'd found in scrapbooks and also in attics and whatnot, and they'd ask Dad to identify the people in them. The reason they did that is that Dad was the oldest guy in the family. He was poorly educated, only an 8th grade education, but he was an extremely intelligent guy and had a phenomenal memory. And he would look at these pictures and he would think for a moment or two and say, okay, this picture was taken between 1921 and 1924. I know that because this Diamond Rio truck in that picture, the Miller family bought that in 1921 in the spring. And that barn that's in the background burned down in the summer of 1924, so that's when the picture was. So this was probably harvest season of 1921, 22, or 23. And then he would name the people in the picture, even though these were like 70 years old or so. Well, typically people would gather around and eventually, sooner or later, it always happened, one of the nieces and nephews and cousins and hanger-oners would say to him how lucky he was to have lived in the good old days when men were real men and women were virtuous and everybody was hardworking and whatnot. And Dad would say, oh yeah, he said, I loved those days. I loved getting up at 4 a.m. to milk the cows when it was 10 below zero, and then come in and not think too much about those black and brown specks that were in that fresh milk, you know. And I loved it when you had to go out and chop wood in order to keep that stove going so we didn't all freeze to death. And I loved watching my 3-year-old sister die of diphtheria because the nearest doctor was 40 miles away and we couldn't afford to pay him anyway, and besides there wasn't any medicine to cure it. Well, those were great days. And the last one of these gatherings my dad went to, it was a couple of years before his health failed and he died in 2005, one of the nephews heard him say this and stupidly said, well, you're wrong. Those were much better times. And Dad looked at him and said, well, first of all, I was there and you weren't, so you don't know what you're talking about. And second, you're as dumb as your mother, and that's quite an accomplishment. So I'm not sure the family, you had to know my dad. He tended to call it like it was. Yeah. Now, what is the point of that little story? The good old days are seen through a rosy glow, I think. You know, a frosted window or something. And the people who were there typically don't like them. Here's another little story that illustrates the point I'm trying to make with all of this. In the summer of 1924, July of 1924, a hot, humid day in Washington, D.C., a 16-year-old kid and his 13-year-old brother were playing lawn tennis. Well, the 16-year-old's shoes didn't fit well, and he ended up with a little blister on the top of his big toe. And then the blister broke during the tennis match, and they didn't think anything of it. A couple days later, he told his mom he didn't feel good, and he showed her his foot, and the foot was swollen, and there were red streaks coming up to the foot and the leg. So his parents called the doctor, and the doctor took the kid to Walter Reed Hospital, Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C., which at that time was the best hospital on the face of the earth. And a large group of doctors worked on the kid, and 3 days later he died of an infection. Well, this was 1924. There were no antibiotics. Arthur Fleming, the British biologist who found penicillin, was still 4 years away from doing that. And besides, penicillin didn't become medically available until the 1940s. That kid was Calvin Coolidge Jr. The tennis match took place on the White House lawn. Now think about that. The son of the President of the United States dies of a simple infection and nobody could do anything about it. So those were the good old days. I mean, can you imagine that today? No, of course not. It's impossible. Let's take a minute to think about what has changed in, say, the last 100 years. Now, 100 years seems like a long time, right? Let's go like this. Good. It's actually not, if you think about it. Historians consider one generation to be about 25 years. So 100 years, we're talking, in most of your cases, if you think about when your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were born, that's kind of in that range. We're probably in the range of your grandparents for most of you. In my case, you're in the range of my parents. My mom was born in 1917 and my dad was born in 1909. So you can probably have in mind roughly which of your relatives we're talking about. You need to look at some stats here because I'm one of those geezers and I can't remember this. 1915, life expectancy. An American born in 1915 could expect to live 54.5 years. Okay, a 60-year-old was a senior citizen. In 2016, a baby born today in the U.S. can expect to live 78.8 years, just 100 years. Infant mortality in 1915, 1 out of every 10 babies died in the first 6 months. 1 out of 10. Today, it's 1 out of 168. Okay. Back in 1915, 1 out of every 200 mothers died in the first 6 months after giving birth. Today it's about 1 out of every 2,000. It was a tough way to live. The medical care just wasn't there. It didn't exist. And so even a minor illness or an injury can be fatal, absolutely fatal. Housing in 1915, about 80% of everybody rented and 20% owned their houses. Today, it's roughly 36% renting, 64% owning. So it's flipped over, you know. And people who rented houses were prone to being just tossed out at the whim of the owner. There were no laws protecting the people who didn't own their own houses. Electricity in 1915, fewer than 30% of all houses had electricity in them. The others were heated by wood stoves or coal furnaces and lighted by either natural gas or whale oil lamps, or in some cases candles. Not a good way to live. The houses, too, were much, much more difficult to maintain than today's houses. They were dirty all the time because of the soot from the furnaces and the candles and the lighting and whatnot. That partially accounts for why so many women did not work. They didn't have the time. They were taking care of their kids and trying to keep the drafty, dirty houses clean. It's interesting, too, when you consider about work. In 1915, only 23% of the women older than 20 years old worked outside of the home. In 2016, it's about 67% of the women older than age 20 work outside the home. The work was very dangerous, too. In 1913, for example, the mortality rate on the job was 61 workers out of every 100,000 died every year on the job. In 2016, today it's 3.2 out of every 100,000 die on the job. That's partially because back then, over 2/3 of all of the men who were working either in farming or industry, and those are extremely dangerous jobs, and were much more dangerous back then. There was no job security, no rights, and no pay either. For example, in 1915, adjusted for inflation, workers made about 33% of what they make today per week. But the work week was 50 hours long on the average, not 40. That's a modern innovation. Now, here we get down to the interesting thing. In 1915, we had about 100 million people living in the U.S. In 2016, we have about 320 million, give or take a few million. And so obviously we have lots more people. The interesting thing is that the foreign-born people in 1915 were 15% of the population, had been born in a foreign country and then came here. Today, it's about 6% were born in a foreign country and then came here. So we have many more immigrants in 1915, about 100 years ago, than we have now. At that time, that was extremely concerning to a lot of people. The Ku Klux Klan, for example, marched regularly here in Washington. Did you know there were Ku Klux Klan parades on Wenatchee Avenue back in the 1920s? They were protesting Filipino farm workers who were all coming here to take our jobs, and they were getting special treatment and on and on and on. If that sounds familiar to you, it's because substitute the word Mexican, Filipino. The point of all of this is, and here's the inspirational part, I guess, is that the trends in the U.S. are positive over the last 100 years. They're positive over the last 200 years. Just think about the differences that I just described to you. Also, change is a constant thing. We tend to think that the old days were stable. They were not. They were even more agitated than we were in terms of the social changes and whatnot that were going on. And finally, the U.S. is very, very good at dealing with social and political and economic changes. We're much better than most nations on earth. So I'd like to wrap this up by saying, when you hear all of the presidential candidates telling you, in both parties, telling you that things are really bad and if they get elected then they'll fix them up. No, things aren't really bad. Actually, things are very, very good in this country. And finally, be pretty happy that you are alive now and not back when your ancestors 100 years ago were alive. Thank you.